Hello, hello, hello.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
All right. Excellent.
So why don't we do the mandatory shilling at the beginning? So do you want to tell us like who you are, what you do, where people can find you?
Yeah, I'm like an sort of anarchist slash somewhat Marxist YouTuber. My channel is called Zoomer Nation, and I'm going to be making a lot of videos these coming days, so definitely check that out. But yeah, I come from a sort of anti-market socialist perspective, very, you could say radical, even for, typical leftist standards. So that's sort of the perspective I'm coming from here.
Sure. So people can find you on YouTube. I'm sure they can't find you on Twitter, right? You would never bannovate. Um,
All right. I mean, my friend is on Twitter. It's at Kantian Larper. That's the Twitter handle. But
so Kantian Larper, a friend of Zoomer Nation, who you can speak with to get through to Zoomer Nation, you can find on Twitter.
all right, absolutely.
So if you had to summarize your position in like one or two sentences, what would it be?
Yeah, sure. I think that, market socialism is preferable to like a traditional capitalist system because, democratization of the workplace. But I still
Mm-hmm.
think it has features that make capitalism intrinsically problematic, like alienation. I think that there's a coercive necessity of state intervention, and just the incentive structure, I think, is fundamentally problematic. And I don't think it creates the maximal amount of productive innovation, although it might be preferable to our conventional sort of capitalist model. That's my view of market socialism.
Sure. So I guess why don't we focus? So like, my summary for like why I support market socialism is I think that it can deliver. Oh, sorry. There's a little bit of feedback. Do you have a headset by chance, or like earphones or anything like that?
Um, no, but I can do push to talk. If you want.
Sure, that'd be great. Sorry.
All right. Give me a second.
Absolutely. Seems like you got it. Gonna assume yes. I can't hear you if you're speaking.
Um, Apparently, like, uh,
Oh, the voice channel might not have perms.
no, like the push to speak doesn't work on this computer. So, like, I don't really have a headphone near me, so like, I'm not sure. I
That's
can
fine.
just I can just mute while um you're talking if you want or something.
Sure, I know that'd be a little annoying on your end, but it'd be appreciated. It's not too big of an issue.
Yeah. All right, fair.
So I guess the fundamental summary. So your summary is like, as I recall, was market socialism still has coercion, it still has alienation, and it still has some of the inefficiencies or problems of capitalism. So my position is that I think that while simply a move to like cooperative, what's called like free market socialism, like just making everything cooperatives, would have these problems. Market socialism in like modern forms does not. It is possible to, as much as it is possible in like a planning or a gift economy, remove alienation and coercion. I think that it is possible to have like equal reductions of coercion in any of these systems, possibly more in a market system. I think that markets also have an additional benefit that they seem competition seems to have benefits for innovation. That seems to benefit long-term growth. And then the final thing, and I know I'm trying to keep it short for you to parallel yours, is I think that the structures which like lead to like the cyclical problems of capitalism that I assume we're going to get to, I think that these can mostly be solved by like some function of state planning. So a combination of like increased state control and like better structured markets can solve, I think, all of these problems. So that's my general take. Did you have one issue you wanted to start with, perhaps, or?
Could I just briefly just do a rundown of what you said, and then
Sure.
maybe we delve more into the specific details? So I actually agree with you that like the cyclical problems that are like a feature of capitalism isn't necessarily going to be as acute in a market socialist system, or it might even be
Mm.
completely extinguished. But I think that you're sort of contradicting in the sense that I see state involvement as a form of coercion in and of itself, and I think we can get into detail about that.
Well, sure.
If,
So can I ask you an interjection like question?
yeah,
I think that
absolutely.
there are three mechanisms for dealing with scarcity, economic scarcity. There are finite resources and infinite wants. That's like a super simplified version. And the three models, again super simplified, are markets, planning, or gift economies. Which one of these do you think that you'd be closest to advocating for?
I'd say like a decentralized sort of planned economy is what I'd prefer as my model.
So then the question is, so I guess the question is always, I agree that there is coercion involved in markets, right? People holding a job over you and holding money over you is coercion. I will be happy to agree to that. The question then is, how would this be different in like a decentralized planning system, such as like a communalist model or whatever model you prefer?
Right. Right. So there wouldn't be any state intervention to mediate all the sophistications of the market. For example, you need every individual atomistic person within a market economy to be fair. And because of the selfish incentive to engage in a mediated way, that's why the state apparatus is necessary, right? But with a decentralized planned economy without those abstract concepts, where human beings can naturally flourish by reallocating resources to develop productive forces to produce the goods that they're interested in. I think
Mm-hmm.
that model mitigates that problem of coercion. And I think that it's predicated on my perspective that sociologically speaking, human beings have this natural predilection towards, not being antagonistic towards people if those social structures don't incentivize it. And I just don't want to lose track though, because like what you're saying is an interesting question, but I also want to state to this point that I feel like how can a limited coercive society exist simultaneously along with the state apparatus? That's my question. Because you're saying that like market socialism
Mm-hmm.
is like essentially non-coercive in its character. If I recall,
Well,
that's what you said earlier.
Well, so I think that on that note, I just want to make sure we're agreeing on terms here. So you agree that there is some degree of coercion involved in like decentralized state planning. That and more generally, that coercion is on like a spectrum. It isn't like a system is coercive or it's not. It's just simply there are different degrees of coercion.
No, I don't agree. I don't think decentralized state planning is the description of what I'd call it. I'd say it's planned in an abstract sense where you voluntarily have free association of producers, have a federated sort of, I don't know, economy for the lack of a better term, where some planning and consolidation goes on in a voluntary basis. But I don't think it's decentralized state planning. I think coercion isn't really, I don't see it as a spectrum. I think that we have the capacity to eliminate coercion in like completion.
Well, sure. So then I guess the question is like, let's say that we have the full voluntary planning economy. The simplest question is how do we make people, or how do people voluntarily choose? Why would they end up voluntarily choosing to do jobs that basically are shit? Like who's gonna do all the cleaning jobs? Who's gonna do all?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. So human beings collectively as a social ensemble are interested in the development of humanity in its totality. We've been
Mm-hmm.
alienated from that. So we have this mindset within a capitalistic structure that human beings naturally won't do those dirty jobs because they're not interested. But when you allow the full flourishment and the full development of the human being, where they can take some time, to engage in this kind of activity and this amount of time to engage in that kind of activity, I think people will naturally have this predilection towards volunteering to do the dirty jobs in a particular
Sure. I mean, I guess the question
without
is like why?
without the point of a gun.
Sorry.
Because it's part of their own self-interest, okay? Because
Is
being
it?
part of a social ensemble and taking care of those messes, that's in their own interest to build that society. I think human beings are rational actors. I don't think you need the tip of a gunpoint and necessity in order to get them to do dirty jobs or whatever.
So have you ever heard of a collective action problem? Or like an example would be the prisoner's dilemma.
I've never heard of that. No.
So the brief summary for your and I guess the viewer's benefit: prisoner's dilemma is an example of a collective action problem. Let's call it CAP. And in the prisoner's dilemma, you have two people who've been arrested by the police. Both of them get an offer from the police. It's, hey, if you say that the other person did the crime, then we'll let you off with, say, like 1 year of jail. But if neither of you confesses, you'll get off with 0 years of jail. But if both of them confess, they get like 10 years of jail. So there's an incentive. I know it can be hard to understand this without seeing like a graph or something, but here, I'll just bring up like a classic prisoner's dilemma graph. The basic idea is that it's in each individual person's incentive to break with the other, even though they would be better off cooperating with the other. So I don't disagree that to some degree humans are rational, but the idea of a collective action problem is that individuals being rational is not sufficient for the system to be rational.
Okay, so can I interject?
Sure.
I think that these kind of pragmatic problems are more concerning in an abstract society where you're integrating like multitudes of different people within the confines and expecting them all to, collectively act rationally, even though it might contradict the interest of another person within that large sort of community. But I think on a decentralized level, if you really get to engage with other people, if you really get to cooperate with other people in the process of building society, I think that's very distinct from the prisoner's dilemma, where you have this very narrow, particular situation. I don't disagree.
Sure. So I understand that, but the prisoner's dilemma is a particular. Sorry, go ahead.
Hold on. I agree with the dichotomy. I agree that there's a dichotomy between personal interest and collective interest, but that doesn't negate the fact that you can integrate both in a as voluntary as possible sort of way or completely voluntary way. I don't think that's a negation necessarily.
So I guess I'm not saying it's negation. The idea is that sometimes people do things rationally for their individual reasons, which are irrational for society as a whole. So like the classic example would be, like, this is obviously under a profit motive, but rationally, for individuals, firms want to pollute. They want to use like energy intensive like production processes because it's cheaper. But for society as a whole, it's bad because it increases pollution, which causes like economic and ecological consequences like global warming. So you can say, hey, maybe that's not a problem to like profit incentive. But if we're talking about someone voluntarily doing something, then the question comes down to what personal incentives motivate them. And unless we have some reason to believe that like accumulating power or accumulating resources just isn't an issue, I'm not entirely sure how this wouldn't apply to like this context either.
Sure. So I don't necessarily believe in this notion that we can look at this independent from social structures. Notice the particularity of every single analogy you brought to demonstrate your point. It's the threat of prison. It's the idea of pollution for an individual firm. It's almost as though the social structures that exist are what incentivize that behavior. And if you negate all those social structures and create a voluntary mode of association free of all those abstract entities, you're actually extinguishing the worst aspects of human nature. That's the sort of parallel between all your examples. They all imply this society that has coercive elements. So I think
so.
There.
So the question then is, what reason have we to believe that what you describe is the case, right? So you're suggesting that, hey, the reason we observe these things now is because of the social structures. And if we change them to the social structure I described, then these problems wouldn't be an issue. What evidence do we have that this model of social structure would genuinely not have this problem? Like, what evidence or data or like even, I guess, theory, but particularly evidence and data, do we have to believe this?
Yeah, sure. So here's the thing: human beings, the sociological analysis and the studies that have been done on this, and I feel like this is almost universal reality, shows that human beings are naturally, altruistic in a sense. They naturally want to help each other. I'm not just murdering and I'm not just, not murdering and not raping and not, you know, watching child pornography because social pressure. I'm also doing it because we have an inner daemon, and it's based on this intrinsic, and there's even a genetic basis from this, from the stuff I've looked at, that seems to suggest that we have this altruistic desire to help one another. And I think that while it can't be quantified in an empirical way, like consciousness itself can't be fully quantified in an empirical way, just natural observation seems to suggest it. And you have to look at this. You can let me just make this point real quick. So
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you look at this from a not purely empirical standard, but a partially empirical standard. You have to look at the different elements that exist and then make conclusions. So what do I see? I see that people naturally, you and I, we don't want to just murder people if there was no rules and so forth. We see that cooperative democratic economies are, still productive and still efficient, even when they're more democratized than your traditional firms. So that traditional capitalistic notion is eliminated. We know that in pre industrial times there was primitive communism. We know that the sociological analysis seems to suggest that human beings have this intrinsic desire to cooperate. Sure, we don't have this absolute perfect example of a communist society free of coercion, but we know that the human instinct exists to care for one another. We know all of this, and then we can integrate all the empirical evidence we know and then make assertions based on that. That's still how I see it.
So I get that this seems to be, if you wanted one person to talk to about this, it would be a streamer that I recently talked to called Sand Soul. I'll DM their name to you. They do a lot of arguments about like mutual aid and a sort of this sort of idea of generosity. And the problem that I have with this is basically all of the evidence we have in like currently existing society, which might not apply to your future society. I can agree with that, but all of the current evidence we have pretty much doesn't suggest that this is the case. Like the for like a simple one, very few people actively want to get involved in like the politics of their community. Now, part of that is due to apathy, but it's like a universal thing across multiple like types of countries. That's maybe not the most relevant one, particularly for this, but like if we look at, say, for like charity, people tend not to give charity to the poor. They genuinely don't like tend to help out the poor. In the United States, only 3 out of every $10 that are given to charity actually end up in the hands of the poor. Basically, we across a huge like array of like actual evidence from like the current day, it seems like while people are charitable, that charitability is relatively limited, and they also have pretty strong incentives to do stuff like accumulate wealth for their own, to consume. I mean, to put a number on it, right? Like the amount of money that Americans spend on cosmetics each year is around like, I want to say it's around $10 billion. And the cost to end hunger in Africa is around $10 billion per year. Like the propensities here are simply enormous for people to do these sort of selfish things, at least in terms of what they actually do. It doesn't seem like we've any reason to believe, at least in current society, that people are genuinely so altruistic that they would go out and actually solve these issues on their own. And this is even just stuff like poverty. It's not even talking about jobs or whatever.
Absolutely. So I think that what's happening here is a correlation causation fallacy. I think you think that, human beings are naturally selfish based on the empirical evidence we have. They're naturally self-interested. But the thing is, you're acting as though capitalism and capital accumulation in our contemporary society is a product of that natural instinct towards self-interest and trying to screw over others for our own self-interest, whereas I think it's vice versa. I think that the social conditions, the superstructure of capitalism that exists, that's what conditions the behaviors, because human behavior is essentially a duality. We know that from our day-to-day lives. It's about whether or not the social structures that exist incentivize oppression and subjugation and exploitation, or
Sure.
incentivize the better aspect. Wait, can I finish real quick?
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not they incentivize the better aspect of human nature. I think you're in the right direction. You're almost hitting that bullet point, but I think you just got it reversed essentially. Okay.
Sure. So, you said social structures that incentivize exploitation. So I asked before if coercion is on a gradient. Do you think that like social structures that incentivize exploitation are on a gradient?
To an extent.
So then why can't we look at like countries that have structures which reduce the incentives to exploit versus countries that have less incentive to exploit, and see whether these things are true? Whether there is like more charity in the system that you're describing, right? As we get to like 90% of your system, shouldn't we see like more charity? Or is there like this magical point at which suddenly people they like escape these social structures?
That's why I said it's somewhat of a gradient, because the whole idea is to have the embryo of a future society within the modern society, but not like empirically showcase it, because we're just not in those I hate to use that term, but we're not in the material conditions. And you have to look at it from a historical materialist perspective. We're not there yet.
Yeah, but the
we
material
can
conditions here just means like productive capacity. That has nothing to do with like social structure per se.
no. It's absolutely related to social structures because social structures are a product of the productive capacities. So you have to understand that, sure, right now we don't have a perfect example of the utopia I'm talking about, but I think that we can deduce from things I mentioned earlier why that utopia can come into fruition. For example, I mentioned, the general consensus in the field of sociology. I mentioned the fact that, you know, even billionaires, they still, they don't have to, but they still spend money to help poor people in Africa, although that's
Yeah, but
largely cynical.
incredibly little. That's like the point is that charity is actually really small. And like one of the reasons I was mentioning this is like the amount of charity we spend as a percent of GDP, as a percent of people's incomes. Capitalists and labor, everyone's incomes has been 2% for about half a century. It hasn't changed, even as we've built
Hang
up
on,
basically the entire modern welfare state.
hang on. The fact that, wait, hang on. Like, I think this is important. So the fact that, against their own rational interest, they're even, sharing this much money to these group of people. For example, I think Bill Gates wants to give away half of his money after um, he passes away. Like, fact that even with this incentive structure, that there's some degree of altruism is a very significant thing. And I think that, like, that's
But
just, I have a bunch of other examples, but like, you saw in
But
various
examples aren't evidence, right? Like the whole idea here
hold
is that I'm trying to show that there's general trends which suggest that people aren't generous enough to solve these issues. They aren't generous
No,
enough
but
to
those
solve poverty.
general trends are okay. The general trends are just a product of the various systems that have permeated throughout history. And guess what?
Well, sure, but again, as I was trying to be clear, right? If there is a difference in certain types of social structures to incentivize exploitation, and if some systems are less exploitative, which presumably I think we could argue that systems like substantially more welfare, so that jobs are more of a choice, with like a huge amount more redistribution, so that the poor are like less coerced into work. These systems presumably have less exploitation, and yet they don't seem to have like enormously greater rates of charity and people doing these things voluntarily. Um,
Okay, so
it seems supposed to
here's
be
this
culture that determines these things. Is my suggestion. It's
all the previous modes of production that have existed, feudalism, the slavery system, capitalism, what do they all consistently have in common? They're predicated upon a selfish interest for the individual. Okay, the material precedes like the consciousness. That's what precedes consciousness. So consciousness is a product of that material reality. That's the reason why their empirical analysis is not sufficient in the situation, because we simply have to understand that social structures produce certain outcomes in the way human beings behave. That's the reason why
sure.
people are selfish. They give I'm sorry for bringing up the Bill Gates thing. That was a really stupid point. I don't even know why I said that. Like, that's not even my mindset. But setting that aside, like, that's the way I see it. The economic context, the economic structure, that is what produces human behavior. Do you agree that material precedes essence, as in the human consciousness? Do you agree with that premise?
That's actually really not necessarily. No, it's not. It's not actually necessarily clear. Like one of the things I was going to bring up is that the very social structures you're talking about in primitive communism are so incredibly different as to modern society that I'm not sure that you can use them as evidence. Like an example of cultural norms is I took a class on development economics, and we did a whole read through of, I want to say, 3 or 4 studies on like the cultural types of like early mercantilist systems. And so like, for example, there was this one Jewish trading network that spanned like North Africa basically, and it had these like incredibly complicated rules, and if you like violated them you would literally be excommunicated from the family. And the social norms there were like,
Mercantilism isn't primitive society, right? In fact, it's
well,
essentially a precursor to capitalist society. It's
I know,
very
but what I'm trying to suggest is that the social structures here like changed them somewhat regardless of like the material conditions. The social structures are something that were imposed upon. And then I guess the second point, and rather the first point, is that these early societies that you're talking about, these primitive communist societies, were small communities that were relatively like they had like some greater degree of like homogeneity, like everyone knows each other. There's like familial connections. The I really want to cite the book called the History of American Law here. We didn't have contract law until like the 1840s. But what happened is people started having to deal deals with strangers. Back in like ancient times, the vast majority of your interactions are with family. But now in modern capitalism, in like any globalized system, which you need to have if you want to have modern production, you're doing deals with strangers. You don't know them, and you may never know them. How do you do that except via contracts? Except via some degree of like something binding you to actually follow
we can
through on
have
that.
voluntary sort of agreements between people that aren't held at gunpoint to build societies. But to get to your point, yeah, primitive society had more familial connections, but that's also partially a product of the more decentralized character of the way the society is organized, largely by external factors that we have no control over, which is another example of the material externality shaping the overall human behavior and the way people like to associate. But once you reach capitalism, you have the socialization of production, not control, but the social character of the mode of production. You have an abundance of goods. You have the capacity essentially for revolutionary action because of the alienation. It has the underpinnings of that future society we can see that sociology seems to suggest is possible, that mutual aid as a theory.
But what's sociology, right? Like I can easily show you the studies on like private
Okay,
charity
I can
just
show
like not
you.
working.
Hang on, let me DM you.
Sure.
There's a lot to the general consent.
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
You go. I can also send you something from Yale if you want.
Sure. So I guess one of the questions here is, let's say that humans are naturally cooperative, right? How do we know that is to a sufficient degree that it will solve all of these problems, right?
Okay, think of it this way. Okay, so hold on, let me get back. Okay, so think of it this way. Um, okay, let's say human beings. Let's say my theory is right that there's this duality where human beings are naturally cooperative, but they also have a sort of selfish self-interest that is part of the social ensemble. Okay, so human beings, free of all the potential coercive elements that exist, they can their own self-interest voluntarily associate with other people to create a more enriching life. They can produce things for the interest of that community to enrich it, and they don't need a profit incentive. They don't require all these various external, or market forces. They can just do it voluntarily out of just this natural basis. I don't see
Sure.
why all this
Sure.
extra.
I'm saying the reason why generally seems to be because like this has not been able, like we have no evidence of this actually succeeding on scale. Like I guess this is the point I'm trying to get at. Like, yes, people will cooperate. Yes, people will do stuff like charity. But the question is, will they do charity enough to do all of the jobs which currently really, really suck right now? Because we're not just talking about like charity on the weekends. We're talking about charity like 40 hours a week for your life.
Look at the Paris Commune. Look at the Paris Commune. There was a lot of people in that commune that had to do tasks that they don't want to do, but they realized the necessity of this. This project against.
I feel like we aren't going to have a lot of like solid evidence about individual behavior during the Paris Commune, which died in like 3 months. I'm pretty sure. Like,
Hold on. No, but that's very disingenuous because it wasn't the lack of cooperation and the lack of.
I'm not saying it was lack of cooperation. I'm saying we aren't going to have good data because it was only there for 3 months.
It was an external factor that led to its destruction, and ultimately, the fact lasted in 3 months in the city of Paris, while they had to deal with these reactionary forces. The fact that they lasted that long and were able to cooperate is significant. And here's the thing: it doesn't need to be this tons of abundance of empirical evidence. The embryo.
Well, it really does. Most people don't like their jobs. Two-thirds of people don't like their jobs right now, and that's in America. And the rest of the world, and the rest.
Alienation. That's what society will reproduce that, whereas there's an incentive for specialization. You would agree, right? There's less freedom and ability to engage in a multitude of different activities to be the complete individual. You're this alienated, atomistic being within the confines of the market system who's producing labor for profit rather than self-assertion. That is literally incentivizing people to not do more with things. The entire argument you have hinges on this notion that human behavior is a product, or I should say social structures are a product of human behavior rather than vice versa. It's a sort of almost idealistic viewpoint. my opinion.
So I agree that we should decrease alienation as much as possible. We should want to make as many people genuinely enjoy their work as possible. But I guess the question is basically this: like, how many people work for free right now? Very few, in part because they need to pay for their housing and so on. Drop early mics already. Geo122 says, Zoomer, drop early marks already. It's Leninist time. I don't know what that means.
What did he say?
They said, Geo122 said, Zoomer, drop early marks already, please. It's Leninist time. I don't know.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, I get what you're saying.
So sorry, go ahead.
Okay, go. I was just gonna say it means that like. Oh no, sorry, go.
Yeah, I'm gonna let you go.
My bad.
Well, sure. So the basic take that I'm trying to give is the evidence that we have right now just doesn't seem like it leads to this conclusion. Like, if anything, the evidence on like stuff that we can do to promote charity often suggests it's the other way. Like, things that we can do to promote charity are like there's literally studies that when we increase tax concessions, like tax breaks or tax credits for charity, like people do more charity. I guess the thing that I would point to is like we have no evidence that like people are enormously more charitable, enormously more willing to volunteer their time in societies like that of enormously less, I would argue, like commodified or alienated and less like work to escape poverty societies like those of like the social democracies.
Okay, so like I said earlier, I feel like instead of looking at it from the absolute empirical analysis that you're engaging in, it's far more productive to see how in past societies people are able to cooperate and engage in activities. I don't think that
Which past societies?
Look, the problem with your empirical analysis is I don't think that the nature of people in the Paris Commune are fundamentally or significantly different from people today, outside of the external conditioning from social structures and economic institutions and so.
But if you think it is possible, no, I need to get on. I need to get another phone. No.
I got to do this.
If you, okay.
Please. Okay, thank you. So here's the problem. Okay, now I'm forgetting what I'm going to say. I forgot what I was going to say.
Well, so you were saying that people in the Paris Commune.
Okay, I remember now. So we don't need to look at it from this absolute empirical perspective. We can look at these individual circumstances, and from the embryo of that, we can make this totalizing grand image. Because
I don't.
Look, no. Capitalism came to development in the 15th century. We saw the embryo of capitalist society prior, but we didn't have this absolute accumulation of empirical data to justify that. We used the limited examples of empirical data we have, and we connected together, and then we established the conclusion that capitalism is a development from feudalism, although it took many revolutions, many failed attempts, until the Dutch developed a somewhat pleasant model of capitalist economics. So this is the model of empiricism I'm looking at. Look at individual examples and then tie together with rational analysis and then try to move in that direction. I think that is the best way to look at empirical data instead of the way you're doing it, because it's easily susceptible to a correlation causation fallacy, because you assume that it's all human nature, not just a conditioning from external factors. That is why your analysis is so vulnerable. Sorry. That's what. Now you can reply.
Sure. If you think that it's possible for the people in the Paris Commune to get rid of that social conditioning within 3 months, it doesn't sound like it's very strong social conditioning.
Hold on a second. This is a very, I hate to say this, but this is a somewhat ignorant statement about French history, because there's a reason why French people are so violent right now in France. They destroy shit. They're way more class conscious, because the history of France showcases how people spontaneously develop social institutions. They spontaneously develop consciousness, and it permeates in these various historical events like the Paris Commune. The French Revolution, there was definitely a very socialistic energy to it, despite the fact that it couldn't reach socialism because of the material conditions, because people were spontaneously developing the social forces. There wasn't some higher philosopher, like Hegel, that was telling them abstract philosophy, this is the social structure we need to create. It was the human essence, the human nature, which is so fundamental, the positive element of the human nature, the desire for rebellion against coercion. People getting together, forming these social institutions to rebel against the existing society. That is
Okay.
what I'm talking about. That is
So-
the explanation for why the Paris Commune happened, because it's the social conditions and the liberatory nature of human beings coming into fruition.
Okay,
Go ahead.
so if it is possible for people simply through having like a past history of leftist movements and a personal ideology that is leftist to escape the social conditioning, why can't we just look at like leftists and see whether they're enormously more charitable? Like it basically what you're saying is that there's a history of leftist like agitative sentiment in France, right? There's a history of leftist movements in France. That was what led up to the French 1871 Paris Commune. That led them to be instantly able, or quite very quickly able, to escape the social conditioning. So if this is true, why can't we see this in like modern day socialists, in modern day socialist movements?
That's not what I'm saying. I'm
So
saying that.
are you okay? Then let's make this clear. In the Paris Commune, were they able to escape the social conditioning?
An extent, yeah.
Okay, to some extent. So if we can agree that this is a gradient, then why can't we look at other gradients, like say the difference between social democracies and like the United States, and then see, hey, there isn't an enormous increase of charity. People aren't just going out and voluntarily doing a whole bunch of these things all the time. Maybe a little more, but not enough.
Because this is not an empirical phenomenon. The idea of liberation. This is not something you magnify with the magnifying glass and, you nerd type, calculus problems to figure out. This is something that's part of the essence of human beings. And the problem is you're so.
Can we measure the essence of human beings though?
What are you talking about? Like
we can measure the enormous decline of murder. That's something we can measure. Why can't we measure this?
Hold on. No, that's not the best way. You need to look at these thought experiments. Like, think of it this way, okay? If you were stuck in a room, okay, you had all your favorite things in the world, the favorite foods you like, the favorite movies you like, but you're stuck in this room. Those parameters, why don't you like it? Partially because you're not free. Liberation is part of the essence of mankind. This is like self-justifying. Every action you engage in is because of your ability to do so. And what is the condition for liberation? Self-consciousness, solidarity. That's what's necessary to unstrangle yourself from this reality. But you're so into this empiricism that you don't understand these concepts that can't be quantified like that. That's your problem here.
But the problem is that these concepts literally can be quantified. We have quantifications of alienation. We literally study this. I can provide you studies showing that cooperatives, like as they currently exist, lower alienation. So does like inclusive management. People genuinely feel more connected with the products of their labor and with their society. Similarly, like I guess that to me, it seems like you keep flitting between saying that like coercion, not coercion, that alienation and exploitation can be like gradients, and then also wanting to hold them as like a binary. On the one hand, you want to say that, hey, it's possible to like do reforms and reduce the level of exploitation. On the other hand, to say that, hey, these reforms don't count because they don't hit this liberatory nature point, and once we hit this liberatory nature point, then things will all just suddenly change. Which is it?
My answer to that is very simple. Okay, I agree that there's a gradient to an extent, but there's something that transcends that gradient. Okay, it goes beyond it. So yeah, I've seen I watched your conversation with Mouthy Infidel, and you were talking about how in a democratic society, there's less alienation because people are interacting with each other in a democratic fashion. I agree with that. Okay, alienation is a spectrum. But there's a reason people are more happy in that less alienated environment, right? Because human beings naturally don't want to be alienated. So I don't see why it's so idealistic to take that to its logical conclusion instead of empirical cucking like you're doing right now by focusing on behavior that is a product of a social condition. You're trying to do this correlation causation thing, and you're like, oh, look at all this murder that goes on. Look at all this rape that goes on. That's not a productive way to look at it. That's my problem. Sorry, I meant that in a more playful way. I don't mean cuck. I think you're a cuck or whatever. I think like
it will.
I meant that in a friendly sort of way. So just to clarify.
Look, I'll never make I keep these debates as far as I can from blood sports, okay? And I can't believe, you destroyed my trust. Oh, you called me a cuck. Oh, I'm so hurt. I'm so damaged. Oh, it's a real blow.
I hope your thumbnail isn't something provocative, like destroying this 17-year-old on markets. I hope it's.
I mean, since it's mostly been about volunteering, I'd probably just Google Google images volunteering and take the first image. Okay, that's how I usually do it. So the basic take that I'm trying to have here is it sounds like we've moved a little bit from direct conversation about like coercion and more into a conversation about like the nature of knowledge. And so like the reason that I have such strong faith in like knowledge, broadly speaking, is and what actually this is what Mal the Infidel and I were going to record tomorrow is an episode on scientific realism. It's that it seems like the only way that you can explain how science has so effectively like achieved its successes of today, like the fact that right now two computers halfway around the world. Actually, I don't know where you live, like some distance around the world are communicating via a satellite, right? All of this accuracy, every second of this conversation, the only reasonable way to accept this is if you believe that to some degree the scientific method is effective at producing predictive results. And so the reason I focus on empirics is because it allows us to make good, high-quality predictions. And my fear is that the type of evidence that you're using, where you're kind of appealing to stuff that's outside the realm of like data, leads the very high likelihood that you might be saying that's simply untrue because you don't have a good epistemic reason to believe it. That's the very short summary of why.
So I agree with you that empirical data has a place. Okay, 2 + 2 = 4. That's necessary to make observations, make calculations. Of course, the scientific method can be utilized. We can observe the phenomenon of climate change. We can observe social structures in terms of the capacity for the growth of the GDP, the growth of wages within the confines of an economy. I agree that empiricism has its place. That's undeniable. But I think that when we're talking about these more profound questions of how do we develop the best ideal society to maximize well-being? How do we create a society that enables human self-reflection and human consciousness to reach its peak? How do we create that human that Nietzsche is talking about? How do we do that? That requires some empirical analysis, but it also requires a deep dive into the philosophical. It requires a deep dive into the abstract, things that can't be quantified with the calculator or so forth. That is essentially what I'm trying to get at here. Pure empiricism isn't very productive, but empiricism with a rational underpinning that's willing to, get into the, abstract roots of it all. I think sorry, my dad walked in, so I got distracted. But okay,
No
you
worries.
get my point.
No, so in an interview that James Medlock, if you've heard of the Sockdem King or whatever on Twitter, did.
My God, yeah, I know.
The term that they introduced, which I quite liked, was provisional utopia. And I generally appeal to a similar idea. It's that what we want to do is push society as far left as we can within the bounds of the evidence we have, and then experiment with policies that are further to the left. Because the whole point there is we don't want to do policies that will fuck over people, because leftist policies can fuck over people too. There isn't like this socialist magic dust which makes policy not hurt people. And so I guess the thing that I'm suggesting is I would be happy to agree with you if we were like one step away from your society and we tested out something like that, like moving one step further would get us to what you're talking about. But right now we're like 10 steps away and we just don't have any evidence that seems to suggest what you're saying is true. So then I guess in short, why not? Why not in the short term advocate for what like I'm advocating for, right? Why not be a market socialist? Say, let's do the things that we can prove to work. Let's get to that point, and then we can have a conversation. Then, or actually, let me put it very quickly. Why not be a market socialist in the streets? Okay, and you can be a I'm not quite sure in the streets. Okay, you can be whatever you are behind closed doors, but your actual advocacy will be for me.
Okay, I didn't intend for this conversation to become sexual, like with the sheets and everything. But
that's just a meta. It's literally just like a meme.
Right. But like, here's the thing, okay? Just reply in the simplest way possible. Here's how I look at it. I think that the future abstract society, the embryo of it is in the empirical reality. And I mentioned this earlier, but I want to repeat it in a more clear and concise way. So the way I see it, we can look at these various elements of reality. We agree that a lot of innovation right now comes from the public sector, right? Without the as diverse competition of the private sector and so forth. We've seen certain, obviously I agree with you, not universal, but certain limited historical examples of temporary cooperation between individuals that are interested in, developing a society and so forth. We see the theory of mutual aid that has been propagated by analyzing the natural world. Like you say, science is very significant, and how mutual assistance is even more significant than competition in the development of various species. We can look at the fact that a large factor in productivity is, lacking stress. That's a very major factor in how you can be a productive person. Feeling as though you're part of a social community, you feel more purposeful with the labor you're doing. I just take all of that reality together, I mesh it, and then I take some continental philosophy and mix it with all that, like abstract questions. How can we fully realize the human essence, self-realization of the self? How can we transcend what exists and go towards this secular humanism that's Marxian in its character, where human beings can develop their full capacity free of coercion, where we can ask those big questions about the self and the abstract and so forth. How can we be the best individuals possible through social collaboration? All of that mixes together, and I think that it creates this ultimate beautiful utopia that I'm advocating for, essentially.
Sure. So I'm saying that's that's the utopia, okay? And then in the short term, we have like the actual policies we want to see, and the idea is that somewhere in between we have this like provisional utopia. And what I'm trying to say is that the utopia you're talking about is not one that I think that we can prove with evidence, but I do think that we can prove this sort of provisional utopia with evidence, that we can get to a much better place, much closer to what you're talking about, without having to do things which rely on stuff that we don't have evidence for. So why believe? Let me pose it at a very fundamental level. Why believe these things without very solid empirical evidence, when the only evidence we tend to have is these very short-term projects, which we don't have strong, as far as I'm aware, evidence of like the degree of voluntary behavior. Unless if you have like some statistical studies of like the amount of like voluntary activity, like the percent of jobs which are performed voluntarily, like without wages or something in like Catalonia, like be my guest. But I just don't think we have that data at all. So I don't think we can prove that at all. No.
Because the point is that, like I said, we don't need absolute massive accumulation of empirical data to come to basic underlying conclusions. We don't need to act as though French workers are somehow intrinsically different from workers in other areas. We can at least take away basic empirical evidence and information and then deduce conclusions from that. And we don't need to completely leave.
Sure, but we can only deduce conclusions within like some limits. You can't extrapolate just in, like.
Okay.
Yeah, there's limits.
What was the basis in the 13th century? What was the basis for capitalism? What would you argue for in the 13th century to justify your claim that capitalism is the best movement away from feudal society?
Sure, I mean, there was the start of, if you want a book to read about this, it would be Narrow Corridors by Darren Acemoglu, which is spelled Acemoglu. And he points out that like starting in the 1100s to like the 1500s, there were a series of like sort of like mercantile associations and trading organizations that were started up, and they made the Italian city-states incredibly wealthy. That was the source of their wealth. I think there was some headline that came out that like one of those trading families in like Florence or something is still the richest family in Florence today. So the evidence that I would point to would be like, hey, we look at these like systems of like freer trade or like guilds that aren't tied to like feudal systems as being, I don't know, that'd be the kind of evidence there. I do think that it's hard actually to make a full comparison between now and then, because there really wasn't a scientific method back then. It's not entirely fair to say like, what scientific evidence would you point to prior to the existence of modern science?
I'm assuming that you're using modern standards for the 13th century. That's part of the assumption here. But okay, here's the thing. I would rebut you by saying, look, feudal society has lifted how many people out of poverty compared to the past system? Feudal society has developed.
Well, we wouldn't know because we wouldn't have data because it's prior to the invention of science. Like the modern concept of science.
That's not the point. The point is we can still, okay, even if we can't quantify it back then, I feel like, I hope you're being honest with that argument. Even if we can't quantify it back then, we can use today's empirical methods and then come to that conclusion in the 13th century. Like, I don't think that is relevant to the point I'm making. The point I'm making is, okay, these capitalist projects, between the 11th and 15th century, prior to the Dutch like developing like the first real like tangible capitalist project, these are just associating certain elements of capitalism in many cases. This has mixed results. There's failures here. Why should I change my life in this somewhat stable, feudal society? Why should I change to this more chaotic capitalist structure? Feudal origins, like people within that time period will ask you those questions, and you might have to appeal to these abstract arguments that were the basis for, Adam Smith and Ricardo and various classical philosophers who justified the transition to a new mode of production. The abstract arguments of, Lockean style, for example. You might have to appeal to those abstract, a little bit more difficult to empirically establish arguments, and they're important. You at least acknowledge that there's importance to argumentation and rationality beyond just an empirical framework.
Sure, there is an importance to it, but it is purely in the utopian one and in the sort of like hopeful one. It's that we are explicitly saying, hey, we don't have evidence for this, but we think it would be a nice ideal to strive for. That is the whole point of calling it like a utopia or an ideal. It's to say, we can't prove that it works, but we have a lot of evidence pointing in that general direction, and we'd like to move in that direction. That's the sort of provisional advocacy that I'm suggesting that you adopt. It's we move in that direction, and we get closer and closer, and eventually we might have closer evidence of what you're talking about, and then closer and closer, and eventually we would be there. We would all be all the way there.
I think that the problem is I feel like there's some problems to this sort of reformist, move closer and closer type of mindset. I think that fundamentally a significant systemic change requires fast revolutionary action. And Lenin, there's a quote from Lenin, he says I'm paraphrasing, there's several months where nothing happens, and there's a few weeks where tons of shit goes down. I'm paraphrasing. So that I think is true in the sense that we can't just, expect this sort of empirical, slow, bureaucratic movement towards, means testing these various programs and then instituting some cooperatives and then a social wealth fund in this part and then that part. No, we need to understand, I feel coerced. I'm going to set up these revolutionary movements and groups which will utilize electoral in a limited sense, and we're going to create a revolutionary shift based on the sufficient, maybe not abundant, but sufficient data and information we have based on our natural predilection towards liberty, which can't be empirically quantified. That's how we're going to fundamentally shift the system. And there's a lot of pragmatic concerns I have with empiricism. I mean, not empiricism, but like this incrementalism, but that's a whole nother, so we can, go ahead.
Well, sure. So there's really, I guess there's kind of three routes we could go down. One is we could kind of pivot back towards talking about market socialism. We could talk about one of the other aspects of it, perhaps. So coercion seems to be one where we need to talk about utopia, but perhaps we could talk about one of the other ones like exploitation or alienation, which I don't think we need to. I was just going to say the other two things, before we get off this topic too much, the theory that you're proposing seems to me to be this sort of like idea that there's a whole bunch of slumbering socialists out there, like a whole bunch of people who would love to support a socialist leader, if only, not leader, like candidate, like revolution and so on, if only they were provided the true candidate which spoke to them. And I hate to be an empirical cuck, as it were, but almost all the evidence that we have doesn't suggest that this is true. There's evidence that more extreme people who run primaries tend to lose more often, both from the right and on the left. Like the people who run in the right of the Republican Party lose more often, people who run on the left of the Democratic Party lose more often. Part of that is due to like much more complicated reasons than this, but like the very simple thesis is that people in America, by and large, are politically towards the center. If there were these like huge slumbering socialist mass, they sure didn't seem to get woken up by someone like Sanders. Maybe we need to run like 2 steps to the left, and then finally they'd wake up. But it doesn't seem like there's much reason to believe that to be true. I guess the basic take.
Can we get to can I address that real quick before you get to your next? Because that's a lot to.
Sure.
I feel like you're operating with somewhat of a straw man here, because I'm not necessarily arguing that there's going to be this great slumbering socialist that awakens people like Lenin or Trotsky type, or like Hotsky. Instead, I'm saying that we need to create the conditions for revolutionary action. We need to build the foundations for that. Right now, there's a lot of spontaneous violence and action for people with the right mindset. I don't think the point is to radicalize liberals. I think people like Vosh emphasize that. I'm more interested in radicalizing that person in the, that apolitical person that's marching about George Floyd, this important issue of racial justice. I think that many of those people are the gettable ones. And I think it's about building these political coalitions and formations, not really establishing cults of personalities or doing great man theory and expecting this individual to catapult the movement forward. And I also want to address the point. I actually think you perfectly demonstrated what I'm saying. I think you proved my point that pure empiricism isn't helpful when you mentioned the fact that people don't generally pick far left or far right candidates. Donald Trump, a perfect example of that natural out of nowhere phenomenon. Sure, we saw the antecedents to Donald Trump. We saw the destruction of the manufacturing zone by free trade agreements. By the way, I within the context of capitalism, I'm fine with free trade. By the way, I'm not a protectionist. I'm just saying that in terms of explaining the phenomenon. We saw the bigotry that was manifesting. Sure, it isn't perfectly empirically quantifiable. Donald Trump lost the popular vote, but we saw that phenomenon rise from that embryo. And Donald Trump is an anomaly, isn't a consistent phenomenon, but it shows that sort of transformation that I'm talking about that isn't purely empirically based. We need someone like Trump on the left in the sense that we need to pull people into electoralism. Like Donald Trump attracted all those people from the alt-right and the far right and the Pepe memes. We need someone like that on the left without the Pepe memes and 1350 and all that. Instead, we need people like Bernie Sanders who have a permeating message, not because I want Bernie Sanders to go in there and establish a social wealth fund and incentivize cooperative and so forth, but instead because I want to get these in there, become radicalized by Bernie, bring the socialist radicals out in the open. That's what those kind of figures do. And I think for mentioning that was very important.
Sure. So I guess so why don't we do a closing thought on this particular topic, and then maybe we could shift over to I believe alienation.
Another area.
Sure. So my closing thought is that I point to David Shor here. That's David Shor. You can find him on Twitter. One of the big pushes of his argument is that there's a lot of reason to believe that most of the shifts that have happened for like winning or losing elections has been persuasion, not like base turnout. So the classic way to sort of characterize this is this idea that Trump got out the base, or that like Sanders would get out the base, right? Like these candidates are to the left or the right. They are populist. They will get people out to vote. It turns out that there was this one study that I believe one of the authors on 538 authored, which suggested that about 80% of the shifts between like elections can be attributed to persuasion. It's people near the middle that shift from one side to the other. Base turnout is not nearly so strong as an effect as some people, particularly I think on the left, tend to think it is. And I used to think base turnout was a much bigger thing, but I can go and try and find these studies if you'd like. But in short, it seems like persuasion, not turnout, is the key. And so unfortunately, that does lead to a more moderate reformist solution if you actually want to wake people up or get policy change.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did I make a quick closing
Sure.
statement? Yeah, everything that you said is a non sequitur because I'm not talking about base turnout. I'm talking about how figures like Donald Trump attracted so many people into radicalization and so forth. You're right that what you're saying isn't wrong, but I just don't think it's relevant to the point I'm making. I'm making more of a point about how a radical figure coming into the mainstream might attract more people into the politics, and they might use persuasive methods. Obviously a shitty orator is not going to be like Lenin or all these figures, Pol Pot or whatever. But like the utilization of rhetoric is important. The persuasion is important, but I think that what Donald Trump as a phenomenon proved was, that there were many antecedents we could look at to that phenomenon. The populist right upsurge in Europe, Trump, Duterte, all of this, there's these antecedents, animosity towards these groups of people, all of that explaining the phenomenon in a non-perfectly empirical way, but in a rational fashion, we could deduce that. And that's more so the point I was making. But yeah, you're not wrong with what you're saying necessarily.
Sure. So I guess to explicitly pivot, one of the second issues you mentioned about market socialism was like the nature of alienation and the nature of like exploitation. So coercion seemed to be one where we needed to go to the utopia to talk about things. We couldn't talk about like reform sort of. So the question that I would ask again is, do you see exploitation and do you see alienation? And I think we talked about this before as on like a spectrum. Like where you could be more exploited or less exploited.
Okay, so that's a very interesting question. I would say that there exists a spectrum of alienation, but I think that there's a certain point where you can transcend the spectrum and transform completely. But I do think that there is an existing spectrum. Yeah.
Sure. So I agree. Like one of the classic there's this really good quote, which you will find also quoted in The Narrow Corridor by Darren Acemoglu, that free labor, which is what we call wage labor nowadays, free labor is the exception, not the norm. For the vast majority of human civilized history, forced labor, either in like feudalism or in slavery, was the norm. And so weirdly enough, we live in the era of the most freedom for the individual worker that has ever existed. Possibly, with the exception of like primitive communism and so on, we live with the most freedom of like civilized, organized, hierarchical to some degree society.
I think primitive communists were somewhat civilized.
So that could be a whole interesting conversation. So
Yeah.
the take that I'm trying to give is it seems like over time we've gradually been able to like increase the power of workers, maybe with like a stagnation or decline during the neoliberal era, and there's been a decline of unions, which for a variety of reasons since like the 70s or so. But in general, the power of the worker over the past say like century, 2 centuries or so has enormously increased. So to me, that's like about worker power, but we could make similar analogies to stuff like exploitation or alienation. Like the amount of control, the amount of input you have into a managerial structure can be substantially greater if we shift towards more cooperatives and away from more conventional firms, or like the old timey like slave firms or forced labor firms like they had in the colonies. Yeah.
Okay. So here's the thing. I agree that alienation can be mitigated by, a more democratized workplace, like, Mondragon or something, or,
Hmm.
Yugoslavia, like the many Latin American sort of, cooperatives and so forth. So I agree with that point. But I think that the fundamental element of this that you're missing is the fact that you're still operating within a structure that is inherently alienating. And I want to move away from that structure. And can I just quickly explain what I mean by that? And then you can
Sure.
reply. So,
Hmm.
what I mean by that is, I hate to be the theory cut here, but I'm going to be, this is
Hmm.
paraphrasing what said in Capital Volume 1. Ants and bears and whatever animal you want to talk about, what distinguishes those animals from human beings is the fact that they don't have the conscious ability to self-direct their own activity in a spontaneous fashion. The spider can build great webs, the ant can build great systems of organization, but they're not self-consciously doing that. And that to me is the premise, that's the foundation of the Marxian critique of political economy, understanding that reality. And where market socialism fails within that context is that it alienates that fundamental human essence, because you're essentially this atomistic laborer within the confines of a cooperative trying to reproduce profits for that cooperative within a competitive marketplace. And you
Hmm.
see the economy in a very alienated way where you're not engaging in the best labor possible, self-directed activity, spontaneous activity, self-assertion. That's how I see the alienation issue as part.
Sure. So I agree that there's this. I think this is maybe going to be the structure again. There's this utopia, perhaps, where like every labor you do is self-directed. But the question then
No, I think
becomes,
that's natural to humans.
well, so let's pose a very simple example. So to create stuff like bronze, okay,
Please
right? This
clarify
was
like clarification.
sure.
Okay, all I'm going to say, one sentence, clarification.
Hmm.
Uh, ability and the potential for self-directed activity is not the same as having that, like doing that. That's it. Now,
Well, so then if we're just talking about capacity for self-directed activity, meaning like I guess suppose doing things that you enjoy, doing things that you feel benefit society, something along those lines. I was going to point to a simple example. I,
you're sort of making it sound lamer than it is. It's like, it's not just doing things that are fun. It's not like eating a donut or something. It's like self-asserting through your labor. That's your species being, trying to develop humanity and its capacities, being the full, complete individual. See, you have to say it in a poetic way to make it sound cool. Like, it's not just doing entertaining and fun stuff. Okay, go.
Sure. So people choosing how they want to flourish in their beautiful lives. The basic question is
Right. There we go. There we go.
how we are meant to do these sorts of things when, for many resources, you need to some degree to rely on others. So the classic example, and I was pointing to a very basic one, the production of bronze. Is it bronze? I want to say bronze requires both copper and tin. Okay, and copper is usually not found in the same place as tin, so it is very unlikely that your commune happens to sit on like a mine of copper and a mine of tin. So the chance, and in particular, you are very, very unlikely to be on either of these. It's like, I want to say it's like 100, 200 sites around the world for these sorts of things. So whatever, that's unimportant. Let's say, hypothetically, you've got a mine of one, you're in a mine of copper, but you don't have any tin. So you want to make bronze. Is it possible, do you think, to fully self-directedly make bronze without having to come to some sort of agreement with the people who make tin?
Sure. Okay. So this is a very complicated question. I had a feeling it was going to come up, but to address it as concisely as possible. I agree with you that as you voluntarily set up this organization, community, whatever you want to call it, you're going to be lacking particular resources. So one critical
Mm-hmm.
element is having proximity in areas that are most viable to allocate resources. Like like think of it this way, right? Like obviously nobody is going to set up a commune in the middle of the desert with no resources. Like you can't do that. But you need to choose areas that are the most proximal, and revolution requires a global effort. It can be decentralized, but
Sure, let's say tomorrow we have the revolution, right? How do we get, and we've totally decentralized. The state has been destroyed tomorrow, right? Now everything is the local communes? I don't entirely know what your model is, but the local communes, right? So now it's all the local communes. What happens next?
to address okay, so to address so we're assuming that we've achieved liberation across the globe and there's separate sort of decentralized communes, right?
Yep.
Okay, sure. By the way, later if you want to talk about how we get there, I can address that because it seems idealistic. But right now, okay. So the way I see it is that there's these various decentralized communes across the globe. And because human beings are free and unshackled from the profit motive commodity production where things are produced not for their use purely, but also for the exchange value. Once we've escaped that sort of limiting economic structure and model, human beings, as I mentioned earlier, are going to be molded from a new social structure that exposes the more humanistic and caring element of themselves. And because
Sure,
they're so
let me, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let's fully grant that everyone is willing to do this sort of voluntary labor. Is the assertion that people will voluntarily, like mine tin, for example, and provide that mined tin to another community? Or will they receive something in exchange? Is there trade?
okay, think of it this way, okay? They're going to mine the tin, and they're going to reallocate it in the most efficient way possible to the people who need it, because they understand that their well-being is also contingent on these federated groups of people on a decentralized level and their actions and their activities. So there's this sort of mutual benefit that they understand, because propaganda is an essential part of the pre-revolutionary period. Okay, the propaganda that's going to be espoused is also going to transition the mindset and so forth. But that's a side point. The point is, yeah, that's how it's going to work.
Well, sure. So if we're relying on people efficiently distributing resources, how do we know that so to be clear, right? The one agent is, let's imagine we have a total, what's it, like a Kropotkin style, is it Kropotkin? Like it's a public workhouse where anyone can come in and pick up the tools. You've got the tin mine. Anyone can come in and hop in a cart and they can ride on down like Minecraft style, and they can grab a pickaxe and they can go mine some tin if they just happen to want. And then they can choose to take that tin up and choose to voluntarily distribute it to other people. To me, this sounds very unlikely to work. It seems like this would be much more efficient if you wanted to just do one little level of hierarchy of having the commune organize these things. Even
There's
one step.
specialization exists, right? There can be.
But why would people specialize? If everything is provided to them for free because everyone else is doing things voluntarily, why would you specialize?
Okay, here's why. Okay, because this goes to Bakunin's point of shoemaker. That we sort of submit to the shoemaker because of his expertise in that specific area. You can simultaneously specialize in multiple areas with the efficient amount of labor without having individuals specializing in one area in a very rigid sort of way. There's so much potential for human capital on a level that it can be exerted and it can be moved in a way that enables us to develop these resources and do that labor. That's the way I see it, in a vague way, in the vaguest sense possible.
So let me pick a hard example, right? So like brain surgeon, right? It takes maybe 16 years of training to become a brain surgeon. It seems very unlikely that this person is going to have either the time or the ability to pursue like a second or third specialization. Nor would we really want anyone to split their time for such a difficult specialization. So why is this good?
Okay, here's what I'm failing to understand. Nobody is holding at gunpoint someone who you have to engage. The point is, it's like to talk about gender abolition. Nobody is saying at gunpoint we need to get rid of all the pronouns or whatever. We're saying we need to eliminate the foundation. So yes, specialization can exist, but the conditions that require it will not exist. That's the distinction. And before, I know you want to interject, but this point real quick. So I realized that there's going to be some people that engage in activities that require more strenuous tasks in going to university. Although in my ideal system there wouldn't be university, but even though that is the case, I would say that look at Leonardo da Vinci, right? all those things he accomplished, this is not that relevant because specialization isn't rigid and forced, but he was the Renaissance man. He was great at developing arts and creating the framework for the airplane to later come on, and geometry and math and all this other stuff. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's a special phenomenon like that, but that's totally irrelevant in the sense that there's just going to be voluntary choice to engage in more specialized activities because you've become integrated with the human. Okay, you've become integrated with the human collective, so many people will be willing to engage in these activities that require more dedication, and many people will respect them for that without compensation of more wealth or whatever nonsense exists in capitalism.
Well, sure. So, like, this is all possible. It's just the question is, how likely is this? So, if I could provide a simple example, so let's even say that everything you say is possible, right? That like I am not going to say that the system is impossible, but let's phrase it in a different way. How efficient is this system? Is relying on individuals to do this labor voluntarily more efficient than providing some incentives, some degree of coercion into the system? And so, like the classic study that I refer to here is the merit pay study. There is evidence from multiple countries that paying, in particular here, the studies that showed where it was effective is paying teams of teachers or entire schools more money for having more efficacy of teaching their kids significantly improve the outcomes of those kids. I believe the statistic is that. Let me just summarize it before the interjection. Sorry.
No, can you repeat what you said earlier? I didn't hear.
Sure, no worries. Merit pay is when you pay groups of teachers or schools more for the performance of their students. So if a student, like basically what you want to do is look at relative improvement, and you pay the teachers that improve their students more. And this is called merit pay. When you have merit pay in a school, it seems to improve the learning in that school by about 1 month per year, which is pretty substantial. And I can provide that study. It's very interesting. In short, the suggestion is just like you can provide people incentives to work harder. Why rely on voluntary incentives, which we don't know would work, when we can just do things that do work today?
Okay, so this goes into, I think this is the perfect way to transition to the question of innovation, right? Because we're talking about the incentive structure and so forth. So I think this is the good way to like move towards the topic of incentive, right? Like, here's how I reply to that. I agree with you that incentive has significance, but that nothing is like, you wouldn't be eliminating incentive in a post-capitalist society, the abstract society I'm talking about, where we've decommodified the economy, we don't have wage labor anymore. You're not eliminating incentive.
You are limiting disincentive necessarily. If work is voluntary, if there's no coercion, you can't be limiting people's pay based on how well they work, because then someone would have to have the ability to restrict your pay. That's coercion.
But disincentive is contingent on incentive. They're like mutually inclusive concepts. They like require each other.
Could you clarify what that means?
What?
Could you clarify that? I did not understand that.
Right. So think of incentive. Okay, I'm going to be talking graph and study shit, but okay, think of it like this. Okay, disincentive and incentive. Okay, on the left you have the spectrum of disincentive. On the right you have the spectrum of incentive. Sure, in my ideal place, there would be the spectrum of disincentive, like essentially reduced, but technically disincentive still exists because when you're far off in the incentive, like you're going to the far end spectrum of the incentive, not doing it takes away that incentive, and thus it is still an incentive or thus it's a disincentive. You get what I'm saying?
Sure. So to me, what it sounds like is really you're just compressing the zone of incentives. You're saying you don't want there to be big incentives, just little incentives. Is that about right?
Okay, so what I'm saying is disincentive is not having the incentive.
Well, sure, but like those are. So let's say that I tell you that your pay is $100,000, but if you do a bad job, your pay is $100,000, but if you perform on average as well as the average worker does, I will pay you $30,000 less, or $70,000, right? So the average pay is $70,000, but your actual pay is $100,000. To me, it sounds like you're basically just doing the same thing as paying someone less, right?
Okay, so that's a very interesting point you're making. Okay, so this is what I mean when I say innovation can transcend the parameters that exist if we truly wanted to. Okay, so if you do a better job, you get 100,000. But if you do a more poor quality job, for example, you get 70,000. Not as good of a paint job, et cetera, et cetera. But still, you're doing wage labor for another person. And you're doing labor in this context. I assume it's survival, right? Like 100,000, or is there no survival incentive in your example?
Well, so what I'm suggesting is in the example, so in a market social system, I would like no one to be on the verge of survival. Everything you're doing here is fundamentally getting more money for like additional consumption. But in your society in particular, if everything is like non-coercive, you can't restrict anything to anyone, presumably.
Can't restrict. I agree with you on that, but you can still create a spectrum of incentive. But the reason I ask you that,
Via
okay,
what mechanism, though? Aren't you restricting
what-
people then? If you are restricting, then you are using an incentive. Then you are coercing people, right? You are like somehow taking things away from them. You are restricting their freedom.
No, and I'll tell you why. Okay, so incentive structures are best when it's unencumbered by wage labor and it's unencumbered by the market forces, because the market forces essentially make it so that you have less of an incentive to do work because you become so nihilistic and hopeless, and the labor you engage in, you feel as though it's intolerable. You feel as though you're almost subjected to do it. So no matter what spectrum you look at, whether it's 70K, 100K, 150K, that incentive, it's good and dandy and all, and it's better in a capitalist system in the way it functions. But in a socialist system, I'm saying we transcend that incentive model and we create the best incentive possible, which is
So
joy, enrichment, and developing human productivity in the efficient fashion. That's the most greatest incentive possible. Okay, I would rather, it's the reason why, doing sex for money is not the same as having sex with somebody you love, because the incentive is so distinct. Okay, one is monetary. I'm doing it because, often I'm doing it because it's work, and people want that good. But then you do it with someone you love, and it's like, oh my God, this is so amazing. Like, that's the
sure.
analogy.
So people love doing sex and they do it on their own. In fact, it is sometimes hard to stop them, right? So the analogy that I would draw is for stuff like work.
If they're only doing it for wages, that's my point. If they're only doing it for wages,
So if you don't want to talk about it in terms of wages, we can talk about it in terms of in-kind products, right? Like, I don't know what incentive structure you'd be talking about for, say, like a merit pay for a teacher. Maybe it's number of chickens you get, right? You get like +1 chicken for every additional student that gets an A+ or something, right? So it could be in-kind production. It could be, if you were talking about the adulation of your peers, maybe you get like an additional medal at like the people's like medaling ceremony each month or whatever. However you want to talk about it.
Here's the thing. The incentive is a simple one. There's a reason why I brought up the natural phenomenon of sexual activity, because there's a natural incentive to help these kids out, because you're in this integrated community. You love the people around you. You're so close because you're no longer alienated. You feel as though everyone is like a family. It's like those kids' TV shows come to life. Now your incentive is, I care about these people. I love these people. There's no, as Feuerbach, Ludwig Feuerbach talks about the power of love. I think that's a very resonating message. I think that the love that you have for your fellow human is almost a godlike phenomenon and character. That is the perfect, powerful incentive. Would you not agree? Like, you'd much rather do labor, right, for your parents than private company that wants you to like try to survive or whatever by providing them with your labor so that they can make profits, right? Like, that's what I'm essentially.
Sure. So I get that people like to help other people, but it seems like when we provide, so a lot of people like teaching. In fact, in the United States, there are many more teachers, not many, like substantially more teachers than there are teaching slots. People love to teach. So I'm not suggesting that people wouldn't teach. The question is, how can we set up institutions that best help people teach and best help select the best people for teaching? Because loving teaching isn't actually the same thing as being good at teaching. Some jobs have too many people, and you don't actually want the people who are bad at doing that job to do that job. To some degree, you probably want them doing something else. And so the example with teaching is that, hey, when you do merit pay, it generally encourages either individual teachers to teach better or teachers who are better at teaching to enter the teaching profession. All of these seem like reasonably strong arguments for doing stuff like keeping incentives and therefore to some degree coercion.
Okay, so here I already addressed the incentive point and how incentive sustains itself, but here's how I address that point. The problem is, even though this wage spectrum creates a sort of delineation where you can have different levels of quality and then you can determine who's best for the job and who's worse for the job, the problem is you have this sort of roof where incentive can only go this high because it's so monetary in its character. It's so limiting and debilitating in its character. It's undermining the more human essentialist aspect of incentive. So there's a roof to that incentive, whereas the incentive I'm providing is less of a roof and more of a natural sort of incentive. Whereas you're a bad teacher, okay, you're a bad teacher, who knows, you might be a sociopath because you're so connected to other humans that, like, how are you not feeling as though you have this obligation to teach well? And that's a hyperbole, but that's one example. Who knows, people are just going to naturally be like, hey, in this community, we're not liking the way you're teaching. This is not a good job. We feel as though you're monotone, you're not interested in the topic. That sort of natural reconciliation, that's the family dynamic on a decentralized level. We have this natural reconciliation. Hey, you suck at washing the dishes. Can you not do this? Like, hey, you're doing such a shitty job mowing the lawn. Can you stop? Like that kind of process of natural, that's the kind of community I'd like to live in. Not, oh, we're gonna cut your wages, we're gonna raise your wages. Like that just puts a limit. You feel burdened. You feel as though you're within the confines of the economic spectrum. That's not the sort of thing I prefer, frankly.
So if the only incentive to not teach is people like socially pressuring you, it just doesn't feel like this is going to be either a very strong incentive in either direction when we have strong evidence that you can just give people more resources to do that. I couldn't, it looks like something happened in the editing of my document. I lost the study, but I'll go find it in a moment. Interestingly, I used to believe that there was a topping out point for income. This was something a lot of studies found, that above $100,000 per year or so, people weren't actually any happier with monetary income. But there was a new study that was recently released and found that actually there is. Income rises log linearly with happiness, meaning that each doubling of income leads to a linear increase in happiness. So it does suggest that giving poor people money is a lot more useful than giving rich people money. So props to that. Marginal utility of money is still true, but it seems like people are actually still quite happy. They still have needs that go way beyond $100,000. People would happily be living like millionaires if they could. Is I guess the suggestion of this. So I'm not sure that this is true. I guess if I could ask one question, right? I think that all of these are nice ideals. The question is always, to put it in the meme or whatever, what model or evidence leads you to believe that these are more effective alone than having merit pay, or merit pay and social pressure together? Why can't we just do exactly what you talked about and have pay?
Okay, there's two parts to this. Okay, first part we need to address is you referencing those empirical studies. I read that same study where you said that empirically there's two studies. One of that said the cap was at 75,000, and once you pass that, there's no incentive. And then a new study came out that contradicted it and said that the higher you go, the more. I agree with that. That's what I'm talking about when I say there's this sort of transcendence of the empirical data, where you can't really quantify the love you have taking care of the child as part of the community. That's the sort of incentive that is diminished in this sort of empirical analysis, where all you care about is getting more money so you can spend more on these fetishism of these commodities, and fetishize, go to this concert, listen to this crappy music, etc., etc. This sort of incentive is special in its nature. It's a sort of unique, distinct incentive that those sort of empirical studies. And there's two parts to this. Okay, social pressure is not this terrible thing that you think it is. Social pressure simply means, okay, we all have our voluntary responsibilities within a community. We realize this. We try to develop ourselves, try to understand our hobbies and how we can integrate that to create the most prosperous community possible. And sometimes people are not going to do the proper activities, and therefore people are going to understand that and acknowledge that, and reciprocally people are going to talk about it, and that individual is going to understand why their role is not the most efficient for that community, and we can voluntarily settle this. I don't understand why human beings with our consciousness and our capacity can't handle this without some appeal to this monetary structure. As far as the second part you said, why can't we have a relatively free society without with simultaneously having this wage labor as a means of creating incentive? The way I would address this point is, the wage labor is fundamentally a part of the alienation. It's fundamentally a part of the problem. You see yourself simply as this atomistic entity that exists for things beyond you. Because what do wages provide? Okay? Wages allow you to purchase things, consume things. Then those firms accumulate, capital, accumulate profit, accumulate revenue, and then there's more productivity. It's just so atomistic and it's just so non-spontaneous. The system that you're perpetuating, the alienating system that you're perpetuating with incentive of wage labor. That's the problem I see here at its essence.
So I'd be happy to talk more about this, but we've gotten around to the hour and a half time. So maybe I'll respond to that. I could get, and then I'll give you a closing statement. Would that be all right with you?
That's fine.
I'm sorry for, I just don't want to go too long.
I love you.
Okay.
Sure. So the basic take that I'm trying to offer is twofold. One, I think that empirical evidence is really important because we don't want to get rid of structures that are working without evidence that we are adopting a structure that works better. In short, you should try to use evidence to adopt policies that are, substantially even to the left that we have evidence for. Like I've pointed to preventative housing in Finland being a good example for this. Just providing everyone a house seems to be a very evidence-based policy. So that's great, let's do that. But other policies we don't have strong evidence for. Like the suggestion that we could just abandon the wage structure and people would still work just as hard. I don't think that we have sufficiently strong evidence to do this to be willing to engage in such an enormous societal transformation. I think that we want to use some degree. It seems like you need some degree of pay based on merit. You need some degree of pay based on like level of experience required to maximize people getting to jobs that are good fits for them. And that in turn benefits everyone in society. So I guess that would be the second turn. I'm not, what I'm trying to suggest here is like the reason we want merit pay is not just because like it's efficient and like, yes, that makes the line go up. It's that efficiency does genuinely enable the rest of society to have a better well-being. You're talking about human flourishing. When your teachers are better, you can flourish more. The better you can read, the more education you have, the more you are able to meaningfully like engage in society and read. And like that sounds like very that's very reductionist, but in short, like you are more capable the more educated you are. And finally, I guess my final take would be I am not trying to defend sort of like an atomistic perception of society. I've often talked about the necessity almost of like the state, of the government, whatever you want to call it, organizing communal structures to bring people back to a sense of community because we are experiencing an epidemic of loneliness. I do think that you can also use social pressure and social norms to encourage people to work well, but it seems like we have evidence that in addition to those things being useful, it seems like just paying people who work harder more genuinely works. So why abandon that unless we have reason to believe that the alternative works better? So I guess in short, I'm trying to offer a brief defense of like why empiricism is useful because we know it will improve people's lives, a defense of like merit pay because it seems like again it improves people's lives, and a defense of the idea that like yes, we should rebuild community. I'm not just trying to defend like pay people money, that's socialism or something. It's just a part of a bigger socialist project.
Okay. So now for my closing statement, I'll say that, I value empirical evidence. Like I said, you have the scientific method, which is so significant. You have the field of mathematics with the width and strength and length and all the developments that have been made. But fundamentally, Hume's distinction between the is and ought claim is very important here. I think that in order to develop the ought claims, to understand beyond the empirical, you take the empirical, but then you have to make deductions from the empirical. You have to look and utilize means beyond that to really establish concise conclusions. And I think historically we've seen this with the French Revolution, where, as I stated earlier, prior to this, the French masses, I believe is how you say it, I don't know, the working class of the French, they didn't have any, philosopher, tangible ideas guiding them. They didn't have any empirical study guiding what they did. It was fundamentally this premise that we ought to value liberation as a concept. And I think that fundamentally market socialism, it perpetuates three fundamentally problematic things that I think I touched upon here: alienation, coercion, and human harm and undermining innovation. I think that it's alienating. I think that you can try to make it as non-atomistic as possible, but ultimately it'll catch up to you because of the incentive structures that are intrinsic within the market system, exchange value, accumulation of profit, essentially existing within the firm, competing with other firms. And that thus also undermines innovation because instead of bringing these resources together in a pool to develop the economy as well as possible, to develop productivity as well as possible, you're atomized, you're divided. And many of the interests of the people through advertising are conditioned and use values set aside to a significant degree exchange value, and overall coercion persists through the state apparatus that reinforces the market. Some might suggest that the state is needed to socialize, but it does the opposite. It further antagonizes, it perpetuates the inequality and the stratification of society. And so that's my closing statement overall on this debate. And great conversation, interesting stuff happened, but yeah.
Sure. I feel like ultimately this conversation wasn't too much about market socialism and more about like whether the utopian system that you prefer could exist. So I apologize for that. Maybe I should have shifted more to talking about market socialism in the latter half. If I had to offer one word as a closing statement, it would be provisionally utopian, not utopian.
Okay.
Let's see. So then the ending spiel. Why don't you tell us who you are, what to do, and where people can find you?
I am Zoomer Nation. You just type in Zoomer Nation in the YouTube search bar. I haven't made content in 3 weeks because I had to do a lot, but I'm going to be making a lot more. And you can find me you can find my friend on Twitter at Kantian Larper. On Twitter posts, very cool community. And yeah, what I do, I'm a sort of anarchist / Marxist, mix of various ideologies sort of analysis. And I like to look at things from my own independent perspective, I guess. And, yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Well, thank you for coming on, and I hope you have a lovely evening.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
Check him out, folks. Excuse me, sorry. All right, so conventional post-conversation recap. The things I liked are, one, I generally like utopianism and optimism about human nature. So I generally quite like people like Zoomer Nation. I think that is, I much prefer them to like doomers who think that humans are like greedy and can never do socialism or whatever. So I like that, okay? But the things that I really didn't like were, one, it seemed to be a selective rejection of empirical evidence, or selectively only using empirical evidence when it was useful. I don't think that's epistemically valid. I think that if you think empirical evidence is useful for trying to find out what works, you got to apply that consistently, and that means, in part, like there are policies that I would love, but I don't think that I have evidence to support them. So you can't support those policies. Unfortunately, you can gesture in the direction of them, and that's a sort of provisional utopia idea. It's you suggest, hey, we should move towards this and see if this could work, but you can't actually suggest that we do that tomorrow. You need to suggest that we do the thing in between. My God, people are being real yikes in chat. Please don't tell people to kill themselves. I'm gonna time you out. Oh, Bugsy is back, and we can ban them. So the second thing that I quite didn't like is I felt like the utopian discussion here was not productive. That it is impossible, because of the nature of it, to talk about, because it's utopian and so far removed, and explicitly we are to believe that its social structures are so radically different that it would lead to different conceptions of humanity and behaviors of humans, that it is nearly impossible to use that sort of empirical evidence. So I feel like if you believe the first, the utopian evidence just isn't helpful in the second. And I feel like the original topic of this conversation was supposed to be like, can market socialism be considered socialism? And very quickly we got off into talking about coercion. So that's in part my fault, perhaps, as moderator. We should have talked about like, hey, can market socialism solve these problems too? Instead, I think it came into this question of like, and I would partially agree with this. Market socialism can only partially solve these problems. And then they were like, well, but the utopia solves it better. The problem is that it's not clear that the utopia works. So it's impossible to do a one-to-one comparison, because we have evidence pretty cleanly for stuff that's like market socialist, but we don't have evidence anywhere as close to like what would be the utopian system. So it's not fair to compare one to the other. Which can either be in the favor of the utopian one if you don't regard evidence as very important, which she didn't. But if you do regard evidence as really important, then it's incredibly unfair to the utopian system. I like entirely am in line with like a market socialist system or a more planning style system. Those seem to be where any evidence, if it exists, is going to be. The Gabal Lagoon says, "What do you think about the Gargalon principle in market socialism? I think you should gargle on my nuts." I already said it before you typed it. Slow beta. Look at this slow beta. Everyone type slow beta. Got him.